In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I knew a priest back in Newcastle upon Tyne called Father Harvey, who never ever preached from the pulpit. And he brought the lectern right into the middle of the congregation, and he preached from the same place because he said, when we listen to God's word, we are all under the authority of that word. Nobody should be 6 foot above contradiction. Well, this morning, what I want to say to you, some of you may find pretty heavy. So I'm standing on the same level as you because I am preaching to myself. It took me a long time to accept and to get used to Facebook. How many people in this congregation use Facebook? Probably about half of us, maybe. I was always nervous of Facebook, but when I started to get into Facebook, I realized that it was a wonderful social media to connect. You have to be careful what you put on there. If Bishop Love reads what I put on last night about the vote at convention, I might be in hot water. But you can put things on there and you can, as it were, express your views. But you can be together with a whole host of people all over the world, which is remarkable. This week, in fact, only yesterday morning, as I checked my emails and then checked for any messages on Facebook, a priest friend of mine called Father Mark McIntyre back in England had posted something on Facebook which I thought was very good, and so I immediately shared it on my page. And it was a quotation from Pope Francis. And the quotation was this: "The church is a love story, not an institution." The church is a love story, not an institution. Now, I don't want to be too clever for my boots, but I think it might have been better if Pope Francis had said, the church is supposed to be a love story, not an institution. I want you to keep that quotation in the back of your minds as we unpack a little bit about today's gospel. That story about the widow of Nain is a very, very interesting little story. And you can read it at different levels. And I could have read it to you and I could have preached a sermon. In fact, I had a sermon all ready to go for this morning about the widow of Nain. But I can't preach it. Because something else came to me this week which seemed to be much more important than just unpacking something about the nature of why Jesus gave this dead boy back to his mom. But some of the stuff that I'd written in that sermon also fits with what I want to say to you this morning. There's a number of interesting things going on in this simple little gospel story from St. Luke. And of course, remember, this is Luke telling us the story, and Luke, out of all the gospel writers, is the storyteller par excellence. He can spin a good yarn. But he's not just spinning a yarn for the sake of the yarn, he's telling us an incredible truth. The first thing I think which is very interesting, if you go to a commentary and you look about this story, Nain, the name of the village or the little town where this happened, literally means a place like paradise. Just like Schenectady means a place beyond the pines. Nain meant a place like paradise. Well, if you were that widow, Nain wouldn't have felt very much like a paradisal place, would it? The clues are in the story from Luke today. The first thing is she's a widow. She's already lost her husband. She's now totally dependent on the son that has died, her only son. So with the boy dead, there's no social security, there's no pension, there's no payouts. For this woman, it's on the streets begging. That's the nature of the life of that time of Jesus. If you didn't have a husband to provide for you or your son that could go out to work, she is on the streets as a beggar. This is not really a very paradisal kind of place, Nain, is it? It's probably for her one of those places she would love to run a mile. If I could just go somewhere else and start all over again. How many of us have said that kind of thing? So she's in a far from paradisal kind of place. She's lost her hubby, and now she's lost her only son. And the town turns out, probably, out of some kind of compassion for this woman. And there she is, taking out the body, and Jesus comes up to the bier and to the bearers, and he touches it, and he stops them in their tracks. Why? Because Luke says she is in a terrible state, and Jesus has compassion. He has compassion. And he has compassion for very specific reasons, it would seem to me. He's not just feeling sorry, as we might for someone who's lost a loved one. He knows only too well that this woman is now in a mess. No husband, no son to provide. She's on the streets. And it's that which seems to be, according to Luke, the motivating force behind what Jesus does. So he gives the woman her son back in a very practical piece of compassion. Very practical. It's not just feeling sorry in that kind of romantic way. So here we are, Nain, a place which is supposed to be a kind of paradisal place, and everything's going wrong for this woman. Bereavement, huge loss, but the threat of nothingness in her life. And Jesus goes to her with his wonderful compassion. How often we have to see a kind of dying before we see a life. This is a kind of constant motif that runs not just through the New Testament, but through the Old Testament too. A constant motif that sometimes, how far down do we have to go before we really begin to see what God can do? Because when everything is going swimmingly well for us, how many of us even give a second thought to God? It's not till we lose something that we start to ask those deeply profound questions. So, keep in your mind, the church is really a love story, not an institution. Death, I believe, is coming to the institution we call the church. And it's coming to this institution because we have lost sight of the love story, which is God's relationship with all his people. We've allowed the institution to, as it were, take away from us the essence of the love story. And I was thanking God for Pope Francis saying this. I mean, I know he's working pretty slowly at the moment to change things, but everything I hear from him seems to suggest we're going in the right direction. Every now and again he says something and somebody from the Vatican kind of corrects him. Well, they'll find out. But if the church is really about a love story, do we not see a glimpse of this love story in this incredible little story of the widow of Nain? In a place that is supposed to be paradisal, everything is the very reverse. Everything's gone wrong for this woman. But at least the townsfolk support her and they come out to the funeral. And it's that opportunity that Jesus takes to bring the story of his love, God's love, in that compassion, practical compassion, to the situation. Maybe you're shocked when I say that the institution of the church as we've known it is dying. Believe me, where I come from in England, we're almost carrying the institution out on the bier now. But there's not too many people coming to the funeral Because most people don't give a damn about the institution of the church anymore because it's messed them up. It's done bad things to them. It's been the finger-pointing institution, and yet always knowing that the institution is not squeaky clean herself. It's a mess. But we've taken the moral high ground and we've pointed the finger. We've made people feel darned uncomfortable about all their silly, petty mistakes in life, instead of celebrating the love story, which is the essence of why the church exists. Which brings me to the hard bit. I've been coming up here in October 4 years, and never till the last few months have I heard my secretary Donna say to me, "What's going on in St. George's?" I've never known so much unrest, so much nastiness, so many negatives, and yet at the same time we're growing. We are making inroads into a wider community focus of ministry. New people are coming almost by the week and testing us out. What's going on, Father Paul? And she says that because she sees some of the emails and the letters, and she reads the minutes of the vestry, and she hears about some of the upsets and the petty squabbling and the fights, and the group of people who come and say, "We don't want this kind of worship. We want this kind of worship. We don't want all of this nonsense. We want this. And I only want that kind of church, and I only want that kind of church. I only like Rite 1, and I'm not coming to Rite 2, and I'm only a Rite 2 person. Don't think you're going to get me with all that carcinogenic substance in the church, all that incense and stuff. And I want to bang my head against a brick wall." And Donna says to me, "Guess why I don't go to church anymore?" Isn't it telling? The institution has taken over, and we've lost sight of the love story. And that's right here in St. George's. And most of you might be oblivious to some of this nonsense, but it's going on. People write letters to other people and say, "Well, don't ask me anymore because I'm not in charge of this," or "I'm not doing that," or "Ask that person." "Oh, it's nothing to do with me anymore." And someone said to me the other day, "It seems like the old guard is fighting with the new people, and the new people are getting very uneasy with the old guard." Well, I don't think it's quite that simple. I think God is stirring us up. God is taking away some of the props of the old institution and is making us look afresh at what it means to be Christians in St. George's Episcopal Church in 2013, and to have a ministry that takes the love story to the world that desperately wants to hear the love story, but is sick and tired up to here of the institutional BS. And there's an awful lot of institutional BS. Jonathan and Joan sat through convention yesterday, they'll tell you. So how do we rediscover that the church should be the love story of God and his people, rather than this institutional nonsense? Well, I'm going to share with you a story, and you have to take the story and process it in whatever way you can as appropriate to you. Some of you may not see St. George's in this story at all, others will. And I've used this story in other parishes, and I've always had a big kickback for it. Let me read the story to you. A young priest goes to his first parish, and the priest goes to that parish full of eager enthusiasm. But to his disappointment, when he gets there, he finds that the worship services on a Sunday and on weekdays are incredibly poorly attended. The spiritual life of the congregation is at a very low ebb, but the social life is pretty good. Ring any bells? The priest, house to house, visits. He engages with those who never come to church in the local community as he seeks a kind of renewed interest. Several people say to the priest that no, they don't go to that church because it's dead, and they really do not care to attend a church that is dead. So the priest thinks he has to take this and these comments back to the vestry for discussion. And actually, the vestry were in one of those moods where they were being truthful, and they said to the young priest that probably the criticisms were relatively justified, and that the church, to all intents and purposes, was not very alive and was probably dying. So the priest went away and he prayed very, very, very hard. He prayed on his own in silence, morning and evening. And he felt he had an answer to his prayer. So he announced that since the church was considered dead by the people in it and the people outside, it was only right and fitting that he should conduct the church's funeral. And the following Sunday would be the day when they would have the funeral of that church. Guess what? That Sunday, the church was packed to overflowing. Just like we see at funerals, they all turn out to pay their last respects, but they haven't been since the last baptism or the last wedding. The church is crowded. And when the people come, they notice that in front of the altar, there's a casket, a full-length funeral casket. And they're a bit perturbed and concerned at what they see in terms of the casket. Is there a real funeral today, they ask? And so the priest goes up into the pulpit, and instead of a sermon, he gives a eulogy. A eulogy is like a wonderful way of going right through the past and telling the congregation of all the great and glorious things of that church's history. And it's an illustrious history. There's been some great rectors. There's been some characters. There's been a great social life. There was all the great and the good that used to worship in that church. And so the priest from the pulpit eulogizes the deceased, which is the church. He tells of how so much had been accomplished, but everything is in the past. And now he has to express a deep sorrow at the untimely demise of this church and its congregation. He comes down from the pulpit and he comes to the casket. And he lifts up the lid of the casket as though you were going to awake and you were going to pay your last respects. And he invites the congregation from the front to come and file past the casket and pay their last respects. But the priest has been rather clever, because there's no corpse in the casket, but he took a full-length vanity mirror and he laid the mirror along the base of the casket and then dressed it beautifully around the sides. So that as the congregation came and peered in, they saw their own faces. They saw themselves, the dead church. Each person was somewhat taken aback and amazed to see their own face reflected in the mirror at the bottom of the casket. As you might imagine, many were deeply shocked. Some were pretty indignant and annoyed. But then, each of that congregation began to realize something about their own spiritual indifference, and how the institution of that church had taken over from what that church was originally meant to be about. And that was the reason why the church was dead. And it had been eulogized, and its funeral performed. The church is a love story, not an institution. Jesus gives that dead boy back to his mother, not because he feels sorry for her, but because he knows that she needs that dead boy to make her life continue and be of use and to be fruitful and to change things. God, I'm sure, will give us back our church if we see it as being purposeful, useful, mission-oriented, worship-centered. One of the things that always strikes me is that even today, St. George's is held up as this wonderful place for parties, great social events, always great food after the festivals. But few people talk about what happens before. Few people talk about the fidelity of that small group of Christians who gather daily to say their prayers and push that door open and ring the bell. Few people seem to grasp what is at the very heart of our existence, which is to share the love story, not to get wrapped up in the institution. And let's go back to that meaning of Nain again, the place that is like paradise. Maybe we do want our church to be perfect. Maybe we want our church to be a little bit of heaven on earth. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as we don't allow ourselves to attack each other when we think that the other people who are our fellow members don't do it our way, or don't think in exactly the same way that we do. Isn't that half the problem we have with our relationship with the Diocese of Albany? Because we are seen to be the dissenters. We say something different. We follow a different path. But there are many ways to God. We have to be prepared to leave the doors wide open and say to all, you are welcome. Walk with us on our spiritual journey. Share with me your understanding of God. Tell me about why your worship means so much to you, and I can share with you what my worship means to me, and perhaps we might find we are not a million miles apart, because we both are caught up in the love story, not the wretched institution. That story of the widow of Nain, to me, is a wonderful story of death and new life. But all the reasons which undergird why death had to come in order for new life to be given. And if you look at that motif, it's there over and over and over again in the Old Testament and in the New. God always brings new life out of that which is dead. Think no more of Ezekiel's great vision of the valley of dry bones. That's the wonderful, exciting, mysterious, powerful God that we should be in love with. Not this despotic little God who whacks us round the head every time we have a bad thought or mess up in a bad action. The love story, says St. Francis, is the essence of the Church, of Pope Francis, not an institution. Maybe we need to ask ourselves this morning, is there time to rescue the institution and put back at the heart of that institution the love story, which is the story of God, his Son Jesus, and their interaction with the likes of you and me, which I hope is really why we're here this morning, and why we'll be here whenever we can to share that with each other. Because, you know, one of the great things about love stories is they're meant to be shared. What is it about the joy of a couple that announces their engagement, or a couple that invites all their friends to a wedding? We celebrate love stories. We don't crumple them with the weight of a rather silly and sometimes outmoded institution which takes the place of the living God. There's no casket at the front, there's no mirror, there's no trick. It's just my sentiments from my heart today to you, my brothers and sisters, in the love affair, in the love story, which is our faith.